we've seen a ferocious surge of anti-Semitism in America and around the world. Vicious propaganda on social media. Jews forced to keep their hide, their keepers on their baseball hats, tuck their Jewish stars into their shirts. On college campuses, Jewish students blocked, harassed, attacked while walking to class. Anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic posters, slogans calling for the annihilation of Israel, the world's only Jewish state.
Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. Those remarks were given by President Biden last week at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's annual Days of Remembrance ceremony. And they very much echo what we're going to talk about on today's episode. We're going to take a closer look at the rampant and dangerous anti-Semitism that has surfaced around the world in recent months. And my guest is Gavriel Rosenfeld. Gav is president of the Center for Jewish History in New York City and a professor of history at Fairfield University. He is also the author of a new book called Fascism in America, Past and Present, and his work has appeared in many publications, including the Times of Israel. And I had so many questions for him. Okay, so before October 7th, I didn't think that much about anti-Semitism. I am a secular Jew. I certainly identify with my New York Jewishness culturally, but that's about as far as it goes. I've never been to Israel. I wasn't bar mitzvahed. I didn't even know much about Jewish history, certainly the history of Israel. That has changed quite a bit in the last few months. I have spent numerous hours researching and watching and reading and listening, learning as much as I can about Israeli history and the history of the Jews. But my point is, I always believed that anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism that I heard my great-grandparents and even grandparents and even parents talk about was sort of a relic of a different era. You know, many of my relatives were killed in the Holocaust, but that seems so long ago. Of course, I was horrified by news of other anti-Semitic hate crimes, the shooting at a Pittsburgh synagogue that killed 11 people, people chanting, "Jews will not replace us" in Charlottesville. They were all horrible incidents, but they seem like the isolated actions of the fringe far right, just a bunch of nut jobs, and there's always going to be prejudice, right? Well, that's what I thought, until October 7th happened. That date is one of great joy and great agony for me. It is the day that both my children were born, 4 years apart, October 7th. But it is also the day that Hamas terrorists waged the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. They slaughtered babies, they raped women, they burned whole families alive, and they took hundreds of innocent civilians hostage. I don't agree with many of the decisions made by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a result of October 7th. But I'm not going to get into that on this podcast. There are many experts with much more knowledge on the nuanced and complicated history between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the challenges of urban warfare. This episode really is my response to the anti-Semitism that I've seen on college campuses, social media, and even in the mainstream media. Now, as I say this, I can hear some people perhaps yelling at their radios or into their AirPods saying, well, what about the plight of the Palestinian people? Aren't you as shocked about that? And of course, my answer is yes. I abhor watching scenes of people carrying dead babies out of bombed out buildings. But I also believe that you can have two thoughts at the same time. You can be against the way the war is going, but believe that Israel is a sovereign state with the right to protect itself. You can be for a two-state solution, but against Hamas. But too many on the far left and the far right see it as an all-or-nothing situation. I believe what is going on is wrong and it's scary. And I am not trying to give Jews a seat here at the what some people call the oppression Olympics. I have never been a fan of identity politics, and I don't think the solution here is to say, well, my people are more oppressed than your people, so we deserve your sympathy. This is not about who has it worst. This is about understanding hate. This is about using my public platform to ask questions and to express my legitimate concern about what is going on in America and around the world in regards to anti-Semitism. And to really say out loud what so many people are saying quietly because they're scared. They're scared to say it out loud. And so Gav is a great person to talk to about this. He is a wealth of knowledge and has wonderfully measured, intelligent responses to my questions, which I'm sure he's gotten 1,000 times. But I so appreciated him taking the time to talk to me, and I think you will too. So without further ado, I bring you Gavriel Rosenfeld. Gavriel Rosenfeld, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Great to be with you, John.
I am very anxious to talk about this topic with you, something that has been on my mind and I think a lot of people's minds lately. Before we get going, I'd love to kind of understand a little bit about your background and what you do as the president of the Center for Jewish History and a professor of history at Fairfield University.
Sure. So I've been a professor at Fairfield since the year 2000, having done my PhD in history and Judaic studies at UCLA back in the 90s. I've been at Fairfield, which is a Jesuit university, sort of the Boston College of Connecticut, for 2 decades now. And it's been interesting, of course, for many years being a Jewish faculty member at a school that's predominantly Catholic. There aren't even that many Protestants at Fairfield. So at Fairfield, of course, I've been teaching classes in my area of specialization, which is the history of modern Germany, the Third Reich, Nazi period, the Holocaust, modern Jewish history, and then some more like specialized fields such as memory studies and counterfactual history, which examines, things that never happened, which is a whole nother conversation. But since the summer of 2022, I've been on leave from Fairfield to be the president of the Center for Jewish History in New York City, which is the largest archive of Jewish source material outside of Israel. So between the 5 partner institutions whose holdings make up the center, there's more than 6 linear miles worth of materials dating back to the Middle Ages, including the second largest archive of Holocaust source material outside of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. So, that we have everything from a research institute there to constant public programs, symposia, book talks, film screenings, concerts. There's also a huge genealogy center there. We're right off Union Square, and so we're open to the public. I suppose most of the people who come to use our archives are scholars, grad students, professors who are doing research on any number of topics. But because we're very much invested in public history and educating people about hot-button topics, whether it's the rise of fascism or the tensions about Zionism or obviously anti-Semitism as well, we do major events that bring public intellectuals, scholars, and the general public together to try and figure out what we can learn about history so as to better understand the present.
What sparked this interest of yours in Jewish history so that it's really like your life's work now?
Well, so I grew up in an academic family. My dad is a professor at Indiana University, and he established the Jewish Studies program in the early 1970s. He just celebrated his 86th birthday, and he's still teaching at IU.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I think 56th year now.
Wow.
So, there's not a whole lot of professors out there like him. And so I grew up with academic talking points at dinner, watching the news, being invested, of course, in all things Jewish in a town that had very few Jewish families. I think there were 5 Jewish kids in my high school graduating class of 350. So it was always something I was aware of. And just because a lot of my other friends growing up in Bloomington were kids of professors, that sort of line of work just seemed fairly obvious to pursue. And through undergrad and grad school, I pursued that career in academia, and it's a career I've been very happy with. But academia is being roiled by so many larger political trends and larger economic trends, such as disinvesting in the humanities and budget cuts, and the job market is lousy. So, it's a profession like so many others that's in turmoil, but it still has its rewards.
Yep. Welcome to the club. I'm in media and journalism. That has seen better days.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, we're recording this on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I did not do that intentionally, but it is very appropriate to be talking about this topic today, that we're going to talk about anti-Semitism specifically. And President Biden actually gave a speech this morning, a very moving speech, in which he said, that the hatred of Jews continues to lie deep in the heart of many people. He said that there has been, I wrote this down, a ferocious surge of anti-Semitism in the U.S. Do you agree with that characterization?
I think there's certainly a spike in anti-Semitism, there's no question, in terms of public discourse, social media posts. You see the rhetoric on a lot of college campuses shading into, I think, undeniable statements that are anti-Semitic. And of course, in our immediate news cycle, we see anti-Semitism coming more from far left circles. Prior to the October 7th invasion of Gaza, of course, most American Jews were up at night worrying about anti-Semitism coming from the right wing of the political spectrum. And that's one of the things about anti-Semitism historically, is that no matter how much the experience of Nazism has ingrained in a lot of Jews, certainly America and beyond, that anti-Semitism is mostly a right-wing phenomenon. It's certainly the most deadly phenomenon has come from the right. The history of anti-Semitism, of course, dating back to the 19th century, with roots even earlier, makes clear that there are left-wing versions of the same hatred. The sources may be different, but it teaches us, at least those of us who study Jewish history, that you can never be complacent and only imagine that the danger comes from, one side of the spectrum or another. It's sort of always an equal opportunity hatred. And I hate to, sound pessimistic, but having just come out of Passover, a week or two ago, the whole idea that every generation someone rises up to, if not destroy the Jews, make life difficult for them. I mean, that is a lesson that's certainly ingrained in anyone who's Jewish, who's even remotely religious. So vigilance and, opposition to complacency is certainly part of the, card-carrying membership of being Jewish, but it's all the more relevant today.
I mean, it's amazing. If you look up anti-Semitism on Wikipedia, which I did the other day, it's like literally they give a kind of chronology of it. It's literally like every 50 years there's some cycle. And of course, that's just, the big events. I mean, it's always with us in some ways. It keeps happening over and over again. It kind of shapeshifts right into different forms, but it keeps happening. Maybe to step back a minute here, I don't think everybody, including me, entirely even understands what we mean when we say anti-Semitism, because I was kind of amazed to learn that Semitism, Semitic is really referring to a language, right? So it's a strange word. It's there's no such thing as Semites. Saying you're anti-Semitic does not mean you're anti-Jewish people. So explain that term and what it really means.
So, anti-Semitism as a concept dates back to the 1870s in Germany. It was coined by an anti-Semite named Wilhelm Marr, who was trying to lend some academic credibility to a much more instinctive hatred, we might say, in the same way that people back then were talking about socialism and liberalism and conservatism. By adding the letters S and M to a hatred, it sort of was meant to create the impression that there was something scientific about the need to hate Jews. But at the core, of course, of anti-Semitism is either the hatred of Jews, hostility towards Jews, the belief that Jews shouldn't have equal rights to others. And the term Semite, like you said, it is originally a linguistic designation. So you have Indo-European languages, you've got Semitic languages, you've got Romance languages. And so 19th century linguists classified Hebrew and Arabic among other Semitic as, the two of the more prominent Semitic languages whose origins lie in the Middle East. But later racial theorists, when they were trying to classify all of humanity into the different races, red, yellow, brown, black, white, and so forth, they took those linguistic signifiers and they attached them to, or they tried to attach them to skin color and other physiological features, skull size and shape, nose size, and so forth. So there's a lot of blurred boundaries and a lot of pseudoscience that goes into the classification of Jews as Semites, but it certainly dates back to the racial mentality of people in the 19th century, at a time when, prior to the Holocaust, racism hadn't been discredited as it would be after Auschwitz and Treblinka, and of course the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s.
But anti-Semitism isn't just racism, right? It seems to kind of extend beyond that.
For sure.
Can you talk about that with me?
Sure. So as I tell my students when I teach the topic of anti-Semitism, either within the context of Nazi Germany or modern Jewish history or anything else, I always try and distinguish anti-Semitism from racism as follows. There is something called racial anti-Semitism, and some of the worst anti-Semites of the 19th and 20th centuries hated Jews because they were not, quote unquote, Aryan, which were identified as white people. And these same anti-Semites also hated Black people, and they hated Native Americans, and the list goes on. And as far as that goes, racism and anti-Semitism are indistinguishable. They share a lot of the same origins. However, there are three other roots of anti-Semitism beyond racial thinking. You've got economic anti-Semitism, which dates all the way back to the Middle Ages, when Jews were accused of economic sins, whether it's charging interest on loans like usury, or whether in the 19th century, even Karl Marx, believed that Jews, as the progenitors of capitalism, were guilty of the worst sin of the modern era, giving rise to a dog-eat-dog capitalist world. So in addition to the racial root of anti-Semitism, you've got an economic root. You've also got a political root, which is to say a lot of times people hate Jews because of the political threat that they pose. For example, Jews being liberals and trying to get rid of the feudal hierarchies of lords and peasants and clergy and so forth. The people who supported the French Revolution, who were, of course, vastly Christian, there were Jews who also supported getting rid of three estates and the lack of voting rights, because Jews would benefit from that as well. But if you are a supporter of the Catholic Church and a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, and you regret the passing of that hierarchical order, Jews, because they're liberals, will represent a threat. Or later, Jews, if they support socialism or communism, will represent a threat. Then, of course, beyond the racial, economic, and political reasons for hating Jews, there is the original one, which is the religious reason for hating Jews, and that is the original failure, quote unquote, to accept Jesus as the Messiah, and then all the sundry sins that were laid at the feet of Jews over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe. And that Islam, in its own way, more recently, has also seen fit to put at the feet of Jews. So I guess at the end of the day, if hating Jews has four elements, race being one of them, but religion, politics, and economics being at the other level, it's clear that it's a multifaceted hatred. And so I don't want to say more complex, but it's certainly distinct from simple racism.
Right. And it goes, like you said, well, first of all, politically, all Jews, Jews are communists, right? That's been the accusation. But then on the other side, Jews are often criticized for being like the ultimate capitalists and greedy, and the stereotype of like, that famous illustration of the Rothschild, with the globe in his hand, and,
Sure.
like he looks like the devil. And, so they get it from both ends. Why the Jews? I mean, there's 15 million of us in the world right now.
Yep.
We are 2% of the American population. It
Yep.
is, I mean, I think one of the things that what's going on in the world now really made me so much more aware of, and maybe a lot of Jews much more aware of, especially people like me who maybe weren't that plugged into my Jewishness. I don't practice Judaism. I wasn't bar mitzvahed.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel very culturally Jewish as a New Yorker and somebody who just, have just very plugged into that part of my Judaism. But I didn't realize how few of us there were. And I think maybe it's surprising to people, considering, I guess, there's so few of us, and yet there's so much hatred towards such a small group of people.
Yeah.
And over for so many years, for thousands of years.
Yeah, there's it's complicated, as with everything.
Yeah.
But there's a famous essay that Mark Twain wrote in the 1890s, if I'm not mistaken. I forget the title of it offhand. But what he pointed out was at one and the same time, one of the things that people in America admired about the Jews and that other people have long resented about Jews. The thing he pointed out is that over the course of 3,000 years, a very small people have outlasted some of the world's greatest civilizations, whether the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks of Alexander the Great, the Romans. All those civilizations have come and gone. Many of them persecuted the Jews, but for some reason, the Jews had a stick-to-itiveness, a persistence, an ability to survive, despite being such a small people, and, as Mark Twain went on to point out, not only survive, but actually thrive. So that there is this, I would call it one of the key principles behind anti-Semitism. It's the reality of disproportionality that's associated with Jews, whereby Jews are a tiny number of people, but they're overrepresented. They're represented disproportionately in, you name it, the professions,
entertainment,
the world of
media,
finance, media, law, medicine. And so what you find is that the hatred of Jews isn't only about punching down, which is another thing that's typical of racism, people who are white picking on people who are black or brown, seeing them as inferior, but anti-Semitism is also defined by punching up towards people who are seen as having power over you, but also power that's been unfairly acquired, maybe through various machinations behind the scenes, maybe through conspiratorial scheming, maybe behind rigging the system. But, if 2% of American Jews, if 2% of the population of America is Jewish, and yet 30% of the lawyers or 80% of the Hollywood studio bosses or, 20% of the journalists, certain people might look at those statistical disparities and say, what's up with that? That
they
doesn't
must be
seem
manipulating
fair.
something. There must be a conspiracy, right? That's where they go.
Right. And so what defines anti-Semitism is also not just hatred, but conspiracy mongering and also envy. And so anti-Semitism isn't just about hating someone for the sake of hating them. It's also about envying them because they may be seen as having power over you. And so what a lot of people sometimes, a lot of scholars point out is that anti-Semitism can be seen as the resentments of people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum punching up against those people who they feel have power over them, as opposed to, lower middle class black people in the 1920s who joined the Ku Klux Klan as a way of making them feel superior to black people who are even lower on the pecking order than they are. So there's a lot of dynamics here that I think make anti-Semitism distinct.
You wrote a really good essay for the Times of Israel, and it was last year. And it's amazing how much has changed and yet hasn't changed because anti-Semitism has been around forever. But let me just read you what you wrote. And I wonder if you would almost modify it or expand on it. So it says, seen from an historical perspective, anti-Semitism in today's America is not qualitatively new in terms of its ideas, but it is experiencing a shift in how these ideas are being disseminated in the public sphere. Like old wine being poured in new bottles, longstanding allegations against Jews are being spread in new digital forms by people who enjoy mass cultural reach. Hello, TikTok, Instagram. The result is a paradoxical synthesis of normalization and radicalization that is eroding old taboos against Jew hatred and making it more acceptable in contemporary American life. Now, you wrote this, and this essay was really targeted more at the MAGA side of the divide. Like you were talking a lot about Kanye West. This is when Kanye West was tweeting very anti-Semitic things. But now, like in 2024, I'm almost waiting for you to write, because I feel like some of the same things that you're saying are just being used by the left, right? Just different. They're just saying it in a different way.
Right. Well, there's a huge, and it's been going on for literally decades, debate about the line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Right.
And for the most part, although these patterns have been changing slightly, it's been the case for the most part that right-wing anti-Semites hate Jews for reasons that are different from why left-wing anti-Semites would be resentful of Jews. They would probably deny that they hate Jews as Jews, but they would be certainly happy to say they hate Jews if they're Zionists. And so what you see on college campuses and beyond is if, some of the encampments that have been established recently, if the terms of those spaces are defined by only people who are anti-Zionists get to belong, or if Jewish students who are walking past them on the way to class get turned away because there are various self-appointed, spokespeople or guards who say this is a safe space for anti-Zionists, and if you're a Zionist, you can't enter. Obviously, I think that gets very close to qualifying as anti-Semitism, because the fact of the matter is most Jews understand that the existence of the state of Israel, however much they, by the way, might not like and even maybe hate the current government, but the state of Israel should have self-determination, that the Jews who live there should have a right to live just as Muslims in Pakistan or in Qatar deserve to have a state that corresponds to their religious beliefs. But anti-Semitism does become anti-Zionism if there are certain standards that, for example, far left-wing students or activists or others would insist on for Jews, but wouldn't insist on for anybody else.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of people like to say they're anti-Zionist, and it seems sort of safe to say that, because I think what they think they're saying is they're anti-colonialist, but they're different. They're different things, right? I mean, again, I don't want to get into a huge history lesson here, but
sure, the
Jews did not colonize Israel. That's my understanding. I mean, people may disagree with me on this, but that is not my understanding at all of what happened or what's happened.
I mean, again, it's a vast topic. You're right to say that. Certainly, that since the 1880s, there were multiple waves of Jewish migration from Europe to what was then Ottoman Turkish-ruled Palestine, and most of what today is called colonization by left-wing activists was done certainly not in the same way that militaristic colonization that took place by the Germans or the Belgians or the French or the British took place in Africa or in India or anything else. You know, this was a migration pattern of Jews who didn't have any state backing for that migration. Most of them tried to blend into the larger environment. And because they were all having to make themselves liked by the Turkish overlords, there wasn't really much question at that point in time that the Jews who were leaving Europe for the Middle East were going to a Jewish state. I mean, until 1948, there was no Jewish state.
Right. These were refugees. I think that's the one thing that's been, as I've done now more research on this topic, because again, I didn't know a lot about it before October 7th. I was a different person on October 6th. But what I'm understanding now is that the Jews that came in were mostly refugees. In some ways, the story that Israel tells about why Israel is bad PR for us, because it doesn't really tell the story of who the Israelis are.
Yeah, the Israelis are a very, very heterogeneous group of people. I think the population of Israel is like 9.5 million, 7.5 million of them are Jews from all over the world. More than 50% of the population of Israel is from North Africa or the Middle East. And so the whole idea that present-day left-wing anti-Zionists would put forth that, this is a white colonizer, European-descended society that's been oppressing Arabs and Muslims and Christians of color, that is taking an American perspective on colonialism and a European one and projecting it onto a case that really is singular in a lot of ways. I mean, just to zoom out for a second, one of the problems with non-Jews making sense of Jews as a people or Jewish history as a phenomenon is that all the normal categories that you can apply to other parts of the world really just don't fit with respect to Jews. It's a 3,000-year-old people. The Jews are one and the same time a religious people and a secular people. Mm-hmm. They're at the same time white and non-white. They're at the same time, capitalist and communist. There's this idea of ambivalence and being non-categorizable that is eminently frustrating for people who would just like to position Jews into a pre-existing binary viewpoint on the world. And that ambivalence about Jewishness and that difficulty of categorizing Jews and making them fit pre-existing ways of seeing things has always been a source of resentment on the part of lots of people who just start pulling their hair out, not being able to figure out, well, who are these people and why are they so small and yet so persistent? Why are they so small and yet so accomplished? Why are they so small and yet causing headlines that create crises of geopolitics around the world? It's, there's plenty of other ways to view the world as a place of complexity, but at least in the West, for the most part, the presence of Jews in 2,000 years of Western history has always been a kind of thorn in the paw.
So just to be clear, we are not, I'm not saying that I'm for everything that Israel does, that I agree with all the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu and the way he's conducting the war right now in Gaza. But at the same time, it crosses a line when you start saying, river to the sea, and that Israel shouldn't even exist at all. I feel like that is where it crosses a line into anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everybody, Exhibit A being the people of Israel itself, who are marching in the streets, who have been by the hundreds of thousands every day for months, even before the war, because of Netanyahu's authoritarian power grab and his effort to try and reform the Supreme Court in the country, the fact that he's facing multiple indictments, the fact that few people have any faith that he's leading this war with pure motives, because he knows as soon as the war is over, he's going to face criminal indictments, not to mention the fact that he was asleep at the wheel when October 7th happened. All of those things make it perfectly clear to many, many Israelis and many Jews in the diaspora that Netanyahu is a leader whose expiration date has come and gone. And we wouldn't, I certainly personally speaking for myself, wouldn't have any problem with all the protesters in the streets of American cities saying the most strident and hostile things about Netanyahu or the current coalition government that exists there, which is very right of center. But unfortunately, for the sake of trying to bring the Israeli population over to the confidence that a two-state solution and peace with the rest of the Middle East could be possible, all the very strident invective, not just demonizing Netanyahu, but demonizing Israel as a country itself, that is a kind of rhetorical overreach on the part of the protesters that I think is just not serving them very well. And I get it. Protests always use slogans. They always use simple shortcuts.
Right. Genocide, apartheid, right.
Yeah, get people on their side. But it merely makes a lot of Jews who have a 2,000-year-old history of persecution to feel like, again, everyone hates us, our backs are up against the wall, and the proof is in the rhetoric that you see on the streets, and it does simplify a very, very complicated situation.
Yeah, I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. They might be saying, well, you just use anti-Semitism. Like, I'm against this war, and I see the images in the media of these, women with children shrouded, and it's horrible. The images of the war from Gaza, and how could you dare say I'm anti-Semitic? I'm just pro-life. I'm pro-Palestinian. I get that, but I also think there's another side of it that maybe people don't understand. Maybe people are anti-Semitic without even realizing it.
I mean, the problem, of course, and the reason why this, I was talking to my kids the other day about how they are trying to make sense of the protests, and I pointed out that when the Gulf War happened in the early 90s, and then when the war in Iraq of 2003 happened, and when the invasion of Afghanistan happened, there wasn't anything like these protests on American college campuses. And that was when American soldiers were doing some pretty awful things. Abu Ghraib comes to mind, of course.
Yep.
But there weren't protests for weeks and weeks on end, shutting down classes, canceling graduations.
It was quite the opposite. It was almost like if you were against that war, you were considered to be unpatriotic. And, it was like kind of the opposite. Sure.
And I think this generation, the Gen Z, the Gen Alphas, they don't have any living memory of 9/11. Mm-hmm. Anyone who lived through that, and not to mention the wave of terrorist attacks in Europe by ISIS, and the ones we even had here at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando and in San Bernardino, in the mid-2000s, before the United States and other Western forces went into Syria to really get rid of ISIS. Living with that constant threat of terrorism was super stressful. It's ironic, for me growing up in the 70s and seeing how the PLO used the keffiyeh as a sign of their liberation struggle, which was always associated with airplane hijacking and the Entebbe raid of 76 and all kinds of, the Munich Olympic attacks of 1972. For people who are in their 50s and older, the keffiyeh is definitely coded as a symbol of terrorism, whereas for the younger generation that doesn't know that era and only knows Netanyahu's authoritarianism, it's obviously being re-encoded as a symbol of social justice. And there's all kinds of other reasons for that. But I do think it creates a generation gap between people who have a living memory of 9/11 and the 70s and 80s, and also a period when the peace process under Oslo between Rabin and Arafat and Bill Clinton was very, very optimistic. And we thought there might be the real possibility of securing peace. Those were in the years when Israel was still very much at the table, offering peace to the PLO. Unfortunately, the suicide bombing wave of the 90s and early 2000s, largely sponsored by Hamas, drove the Israeli public increasingly to the right, and now Netanyahu is exploiting those right-wing sentiments, and he certainly bears a lot of responsibility for the current impasse.
Is it surprising to you what's happened on the college campus? You're a professor. You mentioned you went to UCLA. That's been sort of a hotbed of
Sure.
protest. Is it a surprise to you, or in some ways, as a sort of student of anti-Semitism and Jewish history, is it sort of like, here we go again?
I mean, I think prior to this wave of student protests, most waves of student protests, for obvious reasons, didn't have any inkling of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I remember at UCLA in the early 90s, there was a long hunger strike in the middle of campus by activists who were trying to get a Chicano Studies program approved, which ended up taking place. This was right, I believe, in 1991 or 92, around the time of the 500th anniversary of Columbus's quote-unquote discovery of the New World. And that was at a time when, of course, not just Spanish-speaking Americans, but Native Americans as well, were wrestling with the question of, was Columbus the founder of America, or was he a genocidal imitator of Heinrich Himmler and the SS? And that was a very testy period, to say the least, and there were a lot of raucous demonstrations at UCLA, but there was no internal division among people who supported that cause. I mean, American Jews had nothing against the Chicano Studies program, and by the same token, in the late 60s, when all the college protests at Berkeley and Columbia took place, it was mostly about American kids being drafted into fighting in Vietnam, and Jews had no reason to object to that either, and they were disproportionately represented in the SDS and so forth. Unfortunately, because of the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you've got two groups that have historically been part of the democratic coalition, Jews and Muslims, who, by the way, have plenty to link them together in their mutual fear of the far right, white nationalists who would view both Muslims and Jews as non-whites and a threat to American Christian values. All of the linkages and alliances they had sort of preserved during the period of Islamophobia and some of the right-wing anti-Semitic attacks under Trump, that has now been shattered because of the Gaza war. And I think it's for this reason that people who are prone to protest on college campuses, leftists, progressives, they now have to kind of choose whose side are they on, the Muslim constituency or the Jewish constituency. And it's a tragic civil war within, a huge base component of the Democratic Party.
It really is tragic, which is why I'm trying to, just try to understand it, and trying to make it, putting it out there publicly to understand that it's nuanced, right? Like, we want to simplify this war, this situation, and yet it's nuanced and has many different sides, and there's different stories being told on each side. And so to try to, to kind of distill it into genocide, apartheid on one side, and, it's just strictly anti-Semitism on the other side, it just seems to not solve anything.
No, it's 100% true. And unfortunately, I do feel like at a deeper psychological level, what a lot of the students, the idealistic students, would like to do in weighing in on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is somehow solve what they'd really like to solve, which is the problem of 300 years in American history of racial inequality, oppression of Native Americans and Black people, hostility towards immigrants. Ever since Trump became president in 2016, and since the racial tensions around Charlottesville and George Floyd's murder really put racial tensions on the top of the agenda for people who are on the left, there's been this endless frustration about the inability to solve, whether it's police violence, whether it's the unequal laws about housing, whether it's any number of other legacies from the era of slavery and Jim Crow, whether it's mass incarceration. Those problems many social justice advocates would like to solve. And because of the concept of intersectionality, whereby all people who are suffering oppression need to link up arms and join against the common oppressor, that has led a lot of people to see Palestinians as brothers and sisters in arms. And my suspicion is that for a lot of American people who are progressives who can't solve our own domestic problems because they're just so monumental, may be getting into the streets and speaking out against what's happening very clearly on their social media feeds with corpses being taken out of collapsed buildings in Gaza, that's something maybe they can have an easier time solving, because Israel's a country of 9 million people,
Right.
7.5 million Jews. It's a country that, as one historian, Walter LaCour, put it, was much too small to be able to get away with the kind of things that bigger countries like India and China can get away with. Obviously, the human rights abuses that take place in both of those countries are massive, but nobody thinks that by marching in the streets, you're going to do anything to change the government of two countries with over 1 billion people.
Right.
So I do think there's some psychological projection and wish fulfillment fantasies being undertaken in these college protests, and the binary thinking of oppressor, oppressed, white, non-white, that's being applied to the Middle East, where, as you said, the reality and the history is so deeply complex and nuanced that it doesn't really conform to that binary, but people don't want to be told that what they see as genocide is more complicated.
I'm so interested because you are a student of you are a teacher of the rise of the Third Reich. And, people love to compare, what's going on now in America or in the world with, pre-Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany. Are there any parallels that you are concerned about? You know that era so well. Do you see things that remind you of?
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest look, since Trump ran for president in 2015, lots of people took some of his extremist rhetoric and said, this sounds suspiciously fascist. And ever since, for the last 9 years, there's been an ongoing debate among academics, journalists, pundits, and others about whether Trump himself should be compared to Hitler and whether Trumpism or MAGAism should be compared to Nazism, or maybe if not Nazism, at least fascism. And it's literally witnessed an enormous amount of spilled ink and tweets and Facebook posts either for or against, and it's a whole separate conversation. But I have no doubt whatsoever that the authoritarian impulse that exists within the MAGA movement, one constituency of which certainly is neo-Nazi. We would, talk about people like Nick Fuentes or some of the Proud Boys, or people who are ardent white nationalists or Klansmen who see Trump as the savior of the white race. Not to mention the shooter at the Tree of Life synagogue, who believe that there's white genocide on the horizon and Jews are bringing people of color as migrants into the country through immigrant aid support and so forth. There are definitely people who would love to just destroy democracy and create the basis of a fundamentalist Christian nationalist white ethno-state. I have no doubt about that at all. Unfortunately, the usual guardrails against that element within the Republican Party, they've sort of collapsed.
Away.
Yeah. And, those same kind of people were active under Eisenhower. They were active under Nixon. They manifested themselves in support for the John Birch Society and the candidacy.
Yeah, they've always been there. Yeah. Is it worse now?
It's much, much worse.
Okay.
Because the temptation on the part of a lot of ordinary elected officials in the Republican Party is to indulge those people rather than to slap them back down and tell them to go under a rock. And the reason they're doing that is because there is an electoral advantage to be had by riling up that base of supporters who make up maybe a hard core of 40% of the American electorate, and they're going to show up to vote for their cult leader, Donald Trump. And that's a threat. Now, what makes it even worse is that if you go back to, Weimar Germany, the Nazis, at the height of their electoral appeal in the free elections of the late 1920s, early 1930s, they were polling over 35% of the vote, but they never got a majority of the vote. The highest total they ever got was 44%. So, there was a dyed-in-the-wool core of German anti-Semites and opponents of democracy that only needed a pretext to be able to kind of seize power illegitimately. And that pretext was provided in the 1920s by the far left, the communists who were very, very opposed for their own reasons to Weimar democracy, who did all they could to try and undermine its foundations because they believed that Weimar liberalism was, in bed with capitalism. Capitalism and liberalism are evil twins. They have to be destroyed in order to make way for the communist revolution. And because of the specter of communist revolution, the Nazis were able to win over more and more middle-of-the-road Germans to support their version of Law and Order. And of course, where you see I'm going with this is that, it's no surprise that people like Elise Stefanik, who's angling to be Trump's vice presidential candidate, and other right-wing Republicans are trying to fan the flames of middle-of-the-road Americans about college protests, saying, hey, look at all these, leftists, they're anti-capitalist, they may be part of a socialist woke agenda that will mean the death of America. And the longer that you have chaos and violence in the streets, the more you're going to be able to sway some of those people to support Trump, no matter how much people, despise him or fear him or suspect him. They'd rather have a strong man in office and peace and quiet in the streets than the alternative. So I think it's the polarization between a far right that is bold and increasingly reckless and a small left, but that causes chaos in the streets that leads people like me to be nervous because, that's what got Richard Nixon elected in 1968 was the violence in American streets, especially the Democratic National Convention in Chicago,
right?
The sight of police squaring off against hippie anti-war rioters, protesters, and so forth. That is just a recipe for nothing good from my perspective.
And unfortunately, if history repeats, this always bodes terribly for the Jews. They're sort of like the first in a line of many people that are then discriminated against or blamed.
Yes, the universal scapegoat. And you mentioned this earlier at the outset of our conversation, that Jews tend to be victimized every 50 years or so.
Yeah.
It always is the case that as, dare I use the phrase, the larger society, I was going to say the host society, but American Jews have been here since the 1600s, or Jews have been in America since the 1600s. Anytime the larger society descends into crisis, whether it's an economic crisis, depression, it's always going to track in parallel with the desire for a scapegoat, and the Jews are always the canary in the coal mine. So anti-Semitism is a symptom of a deeper sickness in society, just like racism is a sign of deeper inequalities within society. And I still very much believe in multiracial democracy and in the promise of the founding ideals of this Constitution and our democratic polity, which have never been fully realized in practice, but I believe that they've always inspired enough people to work within the system to make it work, as opposed to just junking the system entirely and having either a left-wing or right-wing dictatorship. To my mind, reform and social protest go hand in hand, but we always have to be sure not to let those things careen out of control, so that the people who have something to lose decide a strong man is the only way to keep peace and quiet.
So what do we do? I mean, one thing I can tell you we shouldn't do is engage with people on social media about this issue, especially the issue of anti-Semitism, because I've tried that and it's a complete nightmare. But how do you fight it? One of the things we don't want to do, and I guess maybe another lesson from Nazi Germany, is that too many people were quiet about it. And just didn't, assimilated basically.
I mean, obviously, people who listen to this podcast will take away from it what they do. I will say that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the sequence of people who were persecuted in Nazi Germany, either before or during World War II, certainly the Nazis chose Jews and communists as the first victims, but any movement that seeks to define its in-group by identifying an out-group, this is the famous self-other binary, once that first group that's been identified as other has been quote-unquote handled, there is an innate dynamic that requires a second group to be identified, and then a third group. And before you know it, you have not just Jews being sent to extermination camps and labor camps during World War II, you've got this radicalization loop taking place where ordinary Germans who were racially Aryan, but who had been convicted of at least 7 felonies and who had been imprisoned, would be taken out of those prisons and sent to concentration camps to do forced labor until they died, because at a certain juncture, the quest by the ruling authority to keep finding new enemies, that never stops. And so before the cycle of othering and scapegoating kicks in, I think it's important to note that solving problems not by looking to scapegoat anyone, but by actually getting to the source of the problem, that is the way that you can avoid that deadly dynamic. The problem, of course, is that politicians usually would rather scapegoat people and avoid telling their constituents that the answers to the problems they're facing are actually hard. Like you might have to pay more taxes, or you may actually not be able to water your lawn every day for an hour because we're facing a drought.
Right.
You know, you can just say it's the Jews' fault, or it's the Mexicans' fault, or, you know, that's the lazy person's way of getting political power. And unfortunately, most people are susceptible to those hateful scapegoating instincts and would prefer to hear those rather than hear something that would require them to make a sacrifice. So I'm skeptical about human nature to a certain degree, but I know if we know about prior patterns because of historical literacy, then we'll be better able to fend off new examples of those patterns.
Anti-Semitism will never be solved, right? I mean, it's going to be there. I don't think, certainly not in our lifetime, but maybe ever. Do you think so? I mean, I don't know.
I think the more we can create an equitable and just society for all groups so that people are not looking to find enemies for the reasons why they're miserable or unhappy or feeling deprived or misjudged, we're going to be much better off. And so in times where all boats are rising on a rising tide, and people feel optimistic about the future and they feel that their vote counts, that's good for all groups. And obviously, I don't want to center Jews too much. In the case of American history, we've obviously hardly been the main group that's been scapegoated in American history. It's been many, many other groups, at the top of the list being African Americans. And one of the things that's a strength of American society, even though it's a paradox, is that since there's so many minority groups to hate, what's great about America is there's so many people to hate. It's always been difficult to find just one. And that was the tragedy for Jews in Europe. They were the one identifiable minority. So they bore the brunt of all of Europe's own internal problems. But it doesn't mean that we ever can afford to stop working on behalf of the larger social and economic and cultural causes that will make people feel more at ease living in our present day country of 330 million people.
Well, Gab, thank you for fighting the good fight and overseeing all these documents that are so important for people to know about and teaching. It's a wonderful thing that you do. So I appreciate you helping me understand it a little bit better today and hopefully helping my listeners understand what we're going through a little bit more.
Thank you, John. And anyone who's interested in the great work of the Center for Jewish History, we're at cjh.org. We've got a huge website with all kinds of great programs. So if you're ever in New York City, pay us a visit.
I want to go next time I'm in New York. I'm all over it. I've been to the Jewish Museum uptown, but this sounds really great.
Yeah. I'll be happy to give you a private tour.
Okay, awesome. All right. Have a great rest of your night.